3 miles down in the Black Atlantic, where sunlight has never touched the seafloor, camera lights pierce the eternal darkness and reveal something that shouldn't exist. The year is 1968, and the grainy footage shows twisted metal emerging from the gloom like a steel graveyard. There, a massive sail section lying on its side, a nuclear submarine's tower ripped clean away from its hull, as if some giant hand had simply pulled it apart. This is the USS Scorpion, the nuclear submarine that vanished without a trace. On May 22, 1968, taking 99 men with her into the depths. For 15 agonizing years, she was nothing more than a name etched on a memorial wall at the Naval Academy. Wives became widows without bodies to bury. Children grew up never knowing exactly how their fathers died. But what the Navy's cameras found scattered across the ocean floor would challenge everything officials had told those families about their final moments. The evidence lay crushed under 3 miles of water, and every twisted piece of metal told a story that didn't match the carefully crafted official reports. Because sometimes the dead don't stay silent. Sometimes they speak through the wreckage they leave behind. The search for the USS Scorpion began as theater and ended as revelation. On the surface, it looked like any other massive naval operation. Destroyers cutting search patterns through the Atlantic swells, aircraft dropping sonar buoys, submarines probing the depths with their sensitive ears. What the public didn't know was that this elaborate display was largely for show. By October 1968, 5 months after Scorpion disappeared, the Navy's deep-sea research vessel Mizar had already narrowed the search to a 12-square-mile area of ocean floor, 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores. The submarine wasn't there, at least not in any way the searchers expected to find her. Instead of an intact hull resting on the bottom like a sleeping whale, they found destruction on a scale that defied imagination. The Scorpion had been torn into 4 major pieces, scattered across 3,000 feet of seafloor like a child's broken toy. The bow section sat upright in the sediment, almost dignified in its final pose. But everything aft of the torpedo room told a different story. The operations compartment, the submarine's nerve center, where the crew would have fought to save their boat, had been completely obliterated. Debris from this section lay scattered in a fan pattern, suggesting violent decompression that had blown equipment and structure across hundreds of yards of ocean floor. But it was the engine room that stomped the investigators cold. This 50-foot section of the submarine had been compressed forward into the auxiliary machinery space like an accordion, telescoped by forces so immense they boggled the mind. The nuclear reactor, designed to withstand the worst catastrophes imaginable, had been thrown completely free of the hull and lay on its side like a discarded barrel. Most eerie of all was the sail, the submarine's distinctive tower that held the periscopes and snorkel masts. It lay on its port side, separated from the hull, with one running light still mysteriously extended. That light, designed to signal the submarine's position when surfaced, had somehow remained deployed through whatever violence had torn the boat apart. In the eternal darkness of the deep ocean, it seemed like a final desperate signal that would never be seen. The sediment analysis told its own story. There were no signs of external explosion craters, no evidence of torpedo impacts from enemy submarines. Whatever had killed Scorpion had come from within. Dr. John Craven, the Navy's chief scientist for the Deep Submergence Program, studied the initial photographs with growing unease. The destruction pattern was consistent with catastrophic implosion. The submarine had exceeded her maximum operating depth and been crushed like an eggshell by the enormous water pressure. But implosion was supposed to be the end of the story, not the beginning. Something had driven Scorpion past her safe operating depth in the first place. The Discovery team's excitement at finding the wreck quickly gave way to deeper questions. The acoustic data suggested a specific timeline of destruction, But the physical evidence painted a picture of violence that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the known facts of submarine design and operation. When the first detailed survey was completed, one thing became clear. The USS Scorpion hadn't just sunk. She had been destroyed from within, and the evidence of that destruction lay preserved in the crushing darkness of the deep Atlantic, waiting to tell its story to anyone brave enough to descend and listen. To understand what happened to the Scorpion, you have to understand the world she sailed in, a world where nuclear submarines played a deadly game of cat and mouse beneath the waves, where intelligence was worth dying for, and where the wrong decision could trigger World War III. May 1968 was a particularly dangerous time to be an American submariner. The Cold War had reached a new level of intensity, with both superpowers pushing their nuclear forces to the breaking point. Just months earlier, the USS Pueblo had been seized by North Korea, creating an international crisis. The Vietnam War was consuming vast resources and attention. And in the depths of the Pacific, the Soviet nuclear submarine K-129 had mysteriously exploded and sunk, taking all 98 hands with her. Against this backdrop, the Scorpion was completing what should have been a routine deployment with the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. She'd spent months conducting exercises with NATO allies, shadowing Soviet vessels, and gathering the kind of intelligence that only a fast-attack nuclear submarine could provide. Her crew of 99 men, led by Commander Francis Slattery, were experienced professionals who had been through these operations countless times. On May 17th, as Scorpion headed west toward home and the submarine base at Norfolk, Virginia, new orders crackled over the encrypted radio circuits. Intelligence had detected a Soviet naval task group near the Canary Islands, an Echo II-class nuclear attack submarine accompanied by a Cannon-class destroyer. The Scorpion was the closest American submarine, and her mission was simple: get close enough to photograph the Soviet vessels and gather electronic intelligence on their capabilities, but don't get caught. These surveillance missions, known internally as Northern Runs, were among the most dangerous operations of the Cold War. They required submarine commanders to balance aggression with caution, to get close enough to their targets to gather useful intelligence, while avoiding the kind of incident that could escalate into nuclear war. The Scorpion's crew had done this before, but the spring of 1968 was different. Tensions were higher, the Soviets were more alert, and both sides were operating under rules of engagement that left little room for error. The submarine's final position report came at 1:15 p.m. on May 21st, transmitted in encrypted burst communication to Naval Headquarters in Norfolk. Commander Slattery reported normal operations and estimated arrival at home port on May 27th. His crew was undoubtedly looking forward to seeing their families again after months at sea. Some had new babies they'd never met. Others had wives who'd spent sleepless nights listening for news of submarine accidents on the radio. But somewhere in the depths of the Atlantic, perhaps as the submarine continued her covert surveillance mission, something went catastrophically wrong. At exactly 6:59 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on May 22, 1968, the Navy's secret underwater listening network, the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, detected a series of acoustic events from the position where Scorpion was operating. The hydrophone arrays, originally designed to track Soviet submarines, recorded what sounded like a muffled explosion, followed by the terrifying sounds of a submarine breaking apart under enormous pressure. The acoustic signature was unmistakable to trained analysts. They could hear the initial event, something violent enough to compromise the submarine's watertight integrity. Then came the sounds of progressive flooding as seawater rushed into compartments that had never been designed to contain it. The submarine was falling, sinking past her test depth of 700 feet, past the 1,000-foot mark where her hull would begin to groan and flex under the increasing pressure. At approximately 1,530 feet, the laws of physics took over. The cylindrical pressure hull, designed to be one of the strongest structures ever built, began to collapse in on itself. The implosion happened so quickly that the crew would have had no time to comprehend what was happening. The engine room telescoped forward with the force of a train wreck, while the operations compartment simply disintegrated under pressures equivalent to having a freight locomotive sitting on every square inch of surface area. The acoustic analysis suggested that from the initial event to final implosion, the entire catastrophe had lasted no more than 5 minutes. 5 minutes for 99 men to realize their submarine was dying. 5 minutes to attempt emergency procedures that had been drilled into them since submarine school. 5 minutes before the crushing darkness of the deep Atlantic claimed them forever. But acoustic data only told part of the story. The real evidence of Scorpion's final moments lay 3 miles down on the ocean floor, preserved in twisted steel and shattered systems, waiting for investigators brave enough to descend into the abyss and piece together the final chapter of the submarine's life. When the deep-sea submersible Alvin finally made its descent to the Scorpion's wreck site in 1985, nearly 17 years after the disaster, its cameras revealed evidence that challenged almost everything the Navy had concluded about the submarine's loss. The ocean floor had become a forensic laboratory, and every piece of twisted metal was a clue in a mystery that grew more complex the deeper investigators looked. The bow section, sitting upright in the sediment like a steel monument, told the most important story. The torpedo room's hull plating was pinched inward in a distinctive pattern that experienced submarine investigators recognized immediately. This wasn't the kind of damage you'd see from an external torpedo hit or ramming. The metal had been pushed inward from within, suggesting either an internal explosion or catastrophic flooding that had overwhelmed the compartment's structural integrity. But the absence of evidence was as telling as its presence. There were no blast craters in the seafloor around the bow, no scorch marks on the hull plating, no debris pattern consistent with an external explosion. If a Soviet torpedo had sunk the Scorpion, as some conspiracy theories suggested, the physical evidence should have been unmistakable. Instead, the wreckage pointed to a more insidious killer, the submarine's own weapons system. The torpedo room itself was a frozen moment in time. 6 21-inch torpedo tubes pointed accusingly into the eternal darkness, their brass muzzle doors still sealed tight. Inside those tubes, investigators knew, were the weapons that might have destroyed their own ship, including 2 Mark 45 nuclear-tipped torpedoes with plutonium and uranium cores that could level a city block. The nuclear material, fortunately, remained contained within the weapons casings, monitored by Navy radiation specialists who found no dangerous contamination at the site. But it was what the cameras found, and didn't find, in the debris field that provided the most chilling clues. The operations compartment, where the submarine's brain trust would have worked frantically to save their ship, had been so completely destroyed that individual components were scattered across hundreds of yards of ocean floor. Control panels, navigation equipment, communication gear, all reduced to unrecognizable fragments that spoke to the violence of the submarine's death. The engineering section told a different but equally disturbing story. The propulsion shaft, designed to transfer power from the nuclear reactor to the propeller, lay broken on the seafloor with one rotor blade mysteriously missing. This wasn't damage from the implosion. This was evidence of mechanical failure that might have occurred before the submarine even began her final dive. Engineering experts studying the photographs noted stress patterns in the metal that suggested pre-existing problems, possibly dating back to Scorpion's abbreviated 1967 overhaul at Norfolk Naval Shipyard. That overhaul became a crucial piece of the puzzle as investigators dug deeper into the submarine's maintenance history. In the rush to keep submarines operational during the Cold War, normal maintenance schedules had been compressed and critical upgrades delayed. The Scorpion had never received the sub-safe modifications mandated after the loss of USS Thresher in 1963, upgrades that were supposed to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic flooding that appeared to have doomed her. The reactor compartment provided both relief and additional mystery. The S5W nuclear reactor, thrown free from the hull during the implosion, lay intact on its side, with no signs of significant radiation leakage. This was a testament to the robust design of naval nuclear systems, but it also raised questions about the sequence of the disaster. For the reactor to survive intact, while the rest of the engineering section was crushed beyond recognition, suggested that the initial damage had been localized elsewhere in the submarine. Perhaps the most haunting detail was that extended running light on the detached sail. Naval experts studying the wreckage photographs couldn't explain why this particular light would be deployed. Running lights were only extended when a submarine was operating on the surface or preparing to surface. Had Commander Slattery been attempting an emergency blow to get his damaged submarine to the surface? Or was this simply a random mechanical failure that happened to be captured in the submarine's death throes? The sediment patterns around the wreck told their own story of violence. The heavy sections had hit the ocean floor with tremendous force, creating impact craters and skid marks in the soft ooze. The distribution pattern suggested that the submarine had broken apart during its descent, not after hitting bottom. This was consistent with progressive flooding, followed by catastrophic implosion, a death spiral that had played out over several minutes as the submarine fell past her crushed depth. But for all the evidence preserved in the wreckage, key questions remained unanswered. Critical maintenance records from Scorpion's final overhaul had been destroyed or classified beyond reach. Acoustic data that might have provided more precise timing of the disaster had mysteriously disappeared from Navy files. Even the 1968 Court of Inquiry, the official investigation into the loss, had been terminated abruptly before reaching definitive conclusions about the cause. The families of the 99 lost crewmen would spend decades fighting for access to these classified records, convinced that the physical evidence from the wreck site contradicted the Navy's official findings. They pointed to inconsistencies in the timeline, gaps in the maintenance documentation, and the suspicious early termination of the original investigation as evidence of a cover-up that reached the highest levels of naval command. More than 50 years after her discovery, the USS Scorpion continues to rest in the deep Atlantic, a Cold War tomb that holds both the bodies of 99 American sailors and secrets that may never be fully revealed. The wreck site has become a paradox. Simultaneously, one of the most studied submarine disasters in naval history, and one of the least understood. The immediate aftermath of the disaster created ripples that extended far beyond the submarine force. In living rooms across America, families who had kissed their sailors goodbye months earlier found themselves thrust into a nightmare of uncertainty and official silence. Barbara Foley, whose husband Ronald died aboard Scorpion, would later write about the institutional cruelty of being told simply that the submarine was overdue and presumed lost. No details, no explanations, no timeline for when they might learn what had actually happened to their husbands, fathers, and sons. The Navy's handling of the families became part of the larger mystery. Official briefings were sparse and often contradictory. When pressed for details about the search effort, Navy officials insisted they were doing everything possible while secretly conducting operations based on acoustic data that had pinpointed the submarine's location within days of her loss. This deception, revealed only decades later through declassified documents, fed suspicions that the military was hiding more than just search strategies. Dr. John Craven, the Navy's chief deep-sea expert who had led the acoustic analysis efforts, would spend the rest of his career defending the official findings while acknowledging the limitations of the evidence. In later interviews, he admitted that certain classified details about Scorpion's final mission and mechanical condition remained off-limits even to investigators. The submarine had been carrying weapons and equipment that represented some of America's most sensitive military technology, and protecting those secrets took precedence over providing closure to grieving families. The environmental legacy of the wreck presented its own challenges. A nuclear submarine resting on the ocean floor with an intact reactor and nuclear-armed torpedoes raised unprecedented questions about long-term contamination. The Navy initiated a monitoring program that continues to this day, with periodic surveys confirming that radiation levels remain within background norms. Marine life around the wreck shows no signs of contamination, and sediment samples indicate that the nuclear materials remain safely contained within their original casings. But the families of Scorpion's crew were less concerned with environmental impact than with understanding why their loved ones had died. In 1993, when portions of the original Court of Inquiry were finally declassified, they revealed an investigation that had been hampered from the beginning by classified information and institutional reluctance to assign blame for the disaster. Key witnesses had been prevented from testifying about maintenance problems and operational pressures that might have contributed to the loss. The declassified documents painted a picture of an investigation more concerned with protecting the submarine program than finding the truth. References to hot-run torpedoes, weapons that could arm themselves while still in their tubes, were heavily redacted. Details about Scorpion's abbreviated overhaul and the decision to defer critical safety upgrades remained classified. Even the acoustic data that had allowed searchers to find the wreck was withheld from families and independent investigators. This pattern of secrecy extended to later studies of the wreck. When the submersible Alvin conducted detailed surveys in 1985 and 1986, the mission was officially described as part of general deep ocean research. Only years later did it emerge that these dives had been coordinated with the search for the Titanic, a way of providing cover for continued military interest in the Scorpion site without attracting public attention. The human cost of this institutional secrecy became clear in 2012, when families of the lost crewmen submitted a formal petition requesting that the Navy reopen the investigation into Scorpion's loss. The petition, supported by submarine warfare experts and former naval officers, cited new evidence and previously classified documents that contradicted key findings of the original inquiry. The Navy's response was swift and final. The petition was denied without public explanation or review. For the families, this rejection represented the final betrayal in a decades-long struggle for truth. They had buried empty caskets, raised children who would never know their fathers, and lived with the knowledge that the men they loved had died in service to their country. All they had asked for in return was honesty about what had happened in those final moments 3 miles beneath the Atlantic. The broader implications of the Scorpion disaster extended far beyond one family's grief. The loss highlighted dangerous compromises in submarine design and maintenance that were driven by Cold War operational demands. The decision to defer sub-safe upgrades, modifications that might have prevented the catastrophic flooding that doomed the submarine, was replicated across the nuclear fleet as the Navy struggled to maintain patrol schedules while implementing safety improvements. These lessons, learned in blood and salt water, would influence submarine design and operational procedures for generations. Modern submarines incorporate multiple redundant safety systems, advanced escape mechanisms, and communication equipment that might have saved Scorpion's crew. The sacrifice of the 99 men who died with their submarine was not in vain if it prevented future tragedies through improved technology and procedures. But for those who study the Cold War's hidden casualties, Scorpion represents something more troubling: the willingness of institutions to sacrifice truth for expediency, to protect secrets at the expense of accountability. The submarine herself remains a war grave, protected by federal law and naval tradition from salvage or unauthorized disturbance. Yet the information about her loss remains classified, locked away in government files that may never be fully open to public scrutiny. 3 miles down in the Atlantic darkness, surrounded by the crushing pressure that claimed her life, the USS Scorpion keeps her secrets. Her nuclear reactor will remain dangerous for centuries. Her hull will slowly corrode in the cold, oxygen-poor water, and her crew will rest forever at their duty stations. The ocean has claimed many ships, but few have taken with them so many unanswered questions about the price of keeping America safe in a dangerous world. The families who still gather each May 22nd to remember the lost crew know that justice delayed is often justice denied. They have grown old waiting for answers that may never come, comforted only by the knowledge that their loved ones died serving something greater than themselves. But in the end, perhaps the most fitting memorial to Scorpion and her crew is not the bronze plaques or stone monuments, but the questions that remain, questions that challenge us to demand better from the institutions we trust with our sons' and daughters' lives.